Gloria Lattimore Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the H3O Art of Life show. And if you see a gleam in my eyes, because I'm extremely delighted to have the guests that I have here with me today, and I'm very delighted also to have the subject matter that I have here today. The title of the show, of course, is Ancient Kemet, and I know it threw you for a loop when you saw KMT with no vowels, but we'll explain that later. Ancient Kemet, the light of the world. I just decided to come in here and say, bam, you know, we're not going to play around and work up to this. We're just going to come in and claim what's ours. And I brought some people here who are intellectual warriors who can fight this battle and have been fighting this battle, as a matter of fact. In fact, one of them has written a book about the battle for Kemet, and that is Charles Grantham.
Hello, how are you?
How are you?
Fine, thank you.
And then, of course, he's from the Kemetic Institute in Chicago. They're on Oakwood Boulevard in Northeastern Illinois University's Center for Inner City Studies. And one of his colleagues, Josef Ben Levi.
Happy to be here with you.
I'm happy to have you. This is my prodigal son, long lost, come back home finally. And then, of course, Hunter Haviland Adams III. We always want to make certain we say all the parts of his name because he has a very honorable name and a very honorable reputation with Lifeway Sciences, which he founded. Is that correct?
Co-founded with Dr. Carl Spite.
You co-founded with Dr. Carl Spite. And so I used the title Ancient Kemet, the light of the world, because even though we're going to talk about, quote, quote, Egyptology, we recognize that this name was not the name that our ancestors gave to themselves or to the land that they inhabited in ancient times. And so we're going to call Egypt what it ought to be called. We're going to call it Kemet, and we're going to try to keep from using words like hieroglyphics rather than Medu Neter. We're going to try to make sure that we don't fall into the traps that so many others of us have fallen into because we've been miseducated. And so I thank Charles Grantham for this book, The Battle for Kemet. And I'd like for him to open up by talking about his reasons. And in the foreword, you know, Dr. Jacob H. Carruthers, your mentor, wrote the foreword, and then you wrote your introduction. And between you, you have given sufficient reason for us to be interested in this subject. So if you want to say some of the reasons or your primary reason, this is a good time.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to say that I'm very honored to be here on your show, to have the opportunity to speak to your viewers. Yeah, the book, The Battle for Kemet, actually the title itself is taken from a book that my mentor, our mentor, Dr. Carruthers, or as we prefer to call him, Jake, used in his book, Intellectual Warfare. And it speaks to the fact that, like we've said, that the name Kemet itself is the name that the ancient Egyptians used, as opposed to Egypt, which was given to them by, we believe, Homer. And Homer didn't exist until roughly about 800 BCE, whereas the name Kemet came into existence approximately around 3200 BCE when it became the united, it was two lands, the upper and lower, and in roughly about 3200 BCE it was united, and the people at that particular time named the area Kemet. And I guess one of the reasons that I wrote the book was because of the way Kemet has been interpreted by your ordinary Egyptologists. They interpret it to mean the black land after the soil, as if, and that's not to say the soil wasn't important, it was very fertile and whatnot, but if we use the same grammatical rules that the Egyptologists use, because there are grammatical rules in Medu Neter, what's commonly referred to as hieroglyphs, we can see that it's not interpreted as, it shouldn't be interpreted as the black land, but the black community the black settlement, referring to the people themselves as a black people. So that was one of the reasons we thought that it was important to write that, because to get the real reason out why we should call it for what it is, as opposed to Egypt.
All right, and you know, I want to take up this issue right here and right now about whether or not they intended to refer to it as Kemet, the black land, or Kemet, the color of the skin of the black people, because I'm very concerned that we might fall into a trap. In fact, you fell into one just a minute ago when you referred to them as the ancient Egyptians.
Right.
You see how easily we are seduced into continuing that mindset. And the issue that I want to raise here, and I'm sure you're going to be delighted to have it, is that black people never used skin color as a political instrument. It was never a vehicle for describing people, to inferiorize them, or in any way to comment on who they were as a people in terms of their relationship, higher or lower than other people. And so I was reminded that Hunter Adams had taken this up at one point, because he had taken up the definition of black. And it's just as we have a different definition of the so-called hieroglyphs, we have another name and another definition. We have another name and another definition of the so-called Egypt, which of course predates this new thing that these people superimposed upon us later on. So I wanted Hunter to contribute something to this notion of what black means, what it means to be black.
Well, that's a loaded question. But, you know, well, I'm going to do my best here in the time we have, because really you have a whole discourse on black and then its corollary white. You know, one of the things that I have serious problems with, the whole notion of to describe political hegemony in terms of whiteness or white supremacy, because when you say white supremacy, that implies in the English language, and looking at it neurolinguistically, that you're talking about black inferiority, because that's the corollary. So we have to be very careful when we use political terms and project them backwards in the past as in black. But in Kemet, you know, it really gets complicated, because, you know, how do you read Medu Neter? Do you read it literally, or do you read more into it? Because the language was extraordinarily complex. And Charles does talk about that in the first chapter of his book, and talked about that. Early on, you had two names, and that probably was before there was the union of the two lands of Ta Meri, the beloved land, Ta meaning land as we understand it, and Ta Seti, or the land of Seti, which unfortunately got mistranslated as Set, the evil one, but that wasn't quite the case. But then you have Kim, which clearly means black. That's the coal black, no question about that. Everyone agrees that
on that,
Kim
no question
is
about
black.
it. Yeah.
But the problem is, in this case, is another symbol, determinative, that some Egyptologists, or most, will translate as meaning land, but it could also mean city or settlement. And so that would suggest, as Charles' argument, as I understand it, that the people were referring to themselves as the settlement of the black land, or the black settlement. But then when we look at black in itself, black always referred to that which was hidden, that which was profound. You know, there's a rite of Osiris, the black rite of Osiris, where the goal was for an initiate to become Kim Ware, which means the perfect black. So in that sense, black was in the sense of perfectibility, of perfecting one's consciousness. So I would see it that black was talking about the perfectibility of the humans in that area. The beloved land, Dr. King talked about he wants to see a beloved community. And so I think that when we project that notion of the beloved community backwards, as they called it, then you see a connection between the beloved community and the black community, a black beloved community. And so that's where, you know, that's my take on that. You know, I don't know if that agrees with,
you know, there's some validity there. But again, I mean, if we're going to, I would prefer to take yours than the black land, meaning referring to the land itself.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I agree
because
there.
again, like you said, there was
It wasn't
Ta-Seti
just the
and
land.
there was Ta-We. If we're going to interpret it and look at the symbols the same way they look at it, the little symbol that we're talking about is the Nai-Wit, or
looks like a crossroads.
Looks like a crossroads. And in every grammar or dictionary, it's always translated out as city, community, a village,
Right.
with a crossroads, so forth and so on. Given the name of, when we talk about Waset,
Right.
which is today referred to as Luxor by the Arabs, I believe, and it was thought of and spoken of as Thebes by the Greeks. But Waset was also just called, and it has that symbol there, and it was just called the city.
The city.
Okay. And anytime we see that symbol being used, it's always usually referred to as a locality, a municipality,
Right.
you know, a city or something like that. So all of a sudden, when it comes now to Kim and this symbol, why all of a sudden one is shifted and translated out as land when they clearly had the Ta, and if they had wanted to mean land without any, you know, being
Any
ambiguous, they
ambiguity.
would, they could have said Kim Ta Ta Kim.
Right.
And the Ta would have been there, which is land. But they chose not to do that. And like you said, Dr. Peace, color wasn't a problem with them. But they were aware of different people's color. That's obvious because they painted these individuals in the various tombs and temples. However, they always painted themselves a dark red, as some of the Egyptologists would say, or very brown and black. But never did they paint themselves to look like the Indo-Europeans or the Semites. And so we have to be very clear that, and they didn't use their color, I don't think, as like you said, to show themselves as being superior. I think it was just a matter of fact. These were these people, that's what they looked like, this is how we represented them.
And you have said in your book that something with which I totally agree, which is that other people want to set themselves up as experts. And it's amazing that the people who followed us in history, the people whom we taught, are now trying to teach us and trying to teach us the reverse of that which we know to be true.
Yeah.
But the whole thing about misrepresentation and misinterpretation, plagiarism, of marginalization, all of these strategies that have been used not only to discredit us in history, as you say, to take Kemet out of Africa, not only to rename it, but to remove it, and thus to remove the people, Kemet, out of Africa, and therefore to remove the people and the land, Kemet, out of history. I mean, to just still our birthright with us looking at them.
Right. Well, I think, you know, that's the power of language, and one of the reasons why we've made such an effort over these so many years to really learn the language, to read the monuments, to read the text, to look at exactly what it is the documents are saying. For example, in relations to Kemet itself, and to look at one of the names that the people of Kemet used to identify themselves throughout most of the dictionaries, particularly if I give an example of Raymond Faulkner's Dictionary of Middle Egyptian. In Faulkner's Dictionary of Middle Egyptian, when we look at the determinative that identifies the word Kim, K-M, meaning black, which is the same word that is used in Hebrew. In Hebrew, the word is Ham, which also means black, and the same thing in Arabic and most of the languages of that part of the world, whether it be Sumerian or an Akkadian or Ugaritic or any of a number of them, Ebelite, they all use the same term to identify the actual color, black. But when we look at this in Faulkner's dictionary and we see the information that identifies this word black, but next to it, it has people. It has a representation of a man and a woman. So that now we move from the Niwet, the city, to people. So we know it says black people, but in the dictionary that we have, it'll say Egyptians. Well, Egyptians gives us a false impression because it gives us the idea that the people that they're talking about, whom they're identifying as the Egyptians, are the people who exist in Egypt today, who are in fact Arabs that did not get there until 639 AD with the Arab invasion of the modern country that has come to be defined geographically as Egypt. But the people themselves, one of the names they did identify themselves with was the name KMT. KMT literally meant the black people. And it was identified with a man and a woman, which meant people.
And plural.
In plural. So it was clear that they spoke to their own identity. I think another crisis that occurs with this and which is being perpetuated is about the idea of Nubia. The suggestion that the only blacks whoever controlled Kemet at any particular time were the people who were in the so-called 25th dynasty, even though the ancient Kemites really didn't have dynasties. Let me say that. You know, if you look at the Turin at the Turin canon or some of the others that identify the rulers, they didn't necessarily identify themselves as dynasties, which is an idea that came from the Arab writer Ibn Khaldun in his Al-Muqaddimah, where he identified where a lot of it was also identified with the royalty of Europe. But the Nubians, they had a name. The term in the Medu Neter, which is the ancient Egyptian language that is misread as hieroglyphs, which is the Greek word meaning sacred writing, but Medu Neter really is something much more intimate than that. Medu Neter has a more profound meaning. It has a meaning of the divine language, the divine speech from one of the words.
This divides us from from other animals, if you will. I mean, the power to speak. Well, continue.
Right, and what happens is that the Nubians, the word Nebu, is really a word that means gold, because Nebu was the word for gold. But the people who lived in that part of ancient Kemet were they had different names. The Tasseti, they had the Magi, Nehesi. They had various names. And then one of the interesting things that Charles Grantham mentions in his book is the representations on the tombs and in the temples, and there are representations of people, like in the tomb of Seti I, and particularly in the tomb of Ramesses III. And that's one of the things he discusses in the book, which is very true, because we've gone to see this with our own eyes. It's something that they don't like people to see, where you see a picture of the Kemites and the Nehesiu, that is, they identify as Nubians, not only looking exactly the same in terms of complexion, that they're both black, but they also have the same clothing on, the same garments on. And it is clear that the distinction between them can only be seen in the fact that one says, mentions here the Remet, which was another name for the Kemetic people. Which literally meant we the people, and Nehesi. But otherwise, it looks identical.
Is there any relationship between biology and geography? Would the Creator be so remiss as to put people who could not biologically occupy a region in that region? I mean, it would just seem really ridiculous to think that someone without sufficient quantities of melanin could be in the desert under the hot sun all the time and not have the attributes which are required to survive that kind of environment. I mean, how much oxygen can you take in if you don't have a broad nose? What kind of protection will you have if you have very fine strands of hair and not woolly hair covering your head? When you think about it, without having to go to the actual pyramids and look at the drawings that the Kemetic people made of themselves, and one would just understand that environment would be unsuitable for the present people who now occupy it over an extended period of time. And so when we asked, earlier when Hunter was saying that we needed to show illustrations from the book, and certainly we want people to get the book and read the book and see the illustrations, we are the illustrations. We are sitting here, we are the committed people. We have not been removed from history, despite the efforts of those who would like to remove us. But why are they so hell-bent upon replacing us and reducing us, and not only that, but denying us access to the truth about ourselves? Because you spoke about this in your book.
Yeah, and I think that's very important. Yeah, the truth. Yeah, what's the old saying? The truth shall set you free.
Make you free.
Right, and as you also notice that there's still being deliberate lies being told to deny us that, even today. I mentioned in one essay, The Unwrapping of Egyptology, where a Egyptologist at the Field Museum denied the existence of those images in the tomb of Ramses III. Well, that goes back to Champollion's brother, who lied about it in roughly 1832, when his brother, who had first gone into the tomb, when he mentioned that the ancient Egyptians, or the Kemites, sorry, I do have that habit, when he went in and he described what they looked like as dark, very dark red. And his brother, instead of painting those images as his brother described them, left the Kemite white, untinted, unshaded, to give the impression then that the Kemite was white. And then he goes on to say, well, yeah, he's white. Well, if you didn't paint him the correct color in the first place, you can make him any color you want to. So, yeah, it's been deliberate. Yeah, and I guess because the fact that it is a great civilization, it was a great civilization, these were great people, and that's not to romanticize about anything, but all the trappings, if you will, of civilization came from there. So, I mean, I don't find it too difficult why they would try to claim that.
But there were pyramids that were off limits, that you couldn't even visit.
This was the tomb that was off limits, the Ramses III. Okay, we had to literally bribe our way into it. Bakshish is the term.
Bakshish.
Right, monies we had to pay to security people to let us in, turn their head while we photographed, because again it had been closed. We had tried to get into the tomb much earlier. Jake and a number of, matter of fact, students from the center had gone earlier at the insistence of Sheikh Anta Diop, saying that they should go in and photograph this wall before it disappears or whatever the case. And the efforts had been stymied for a number of reasons, and finally in '86 and '87 we were able to go in, a small group of us, and photograph that. It wasn't intentional. I mean, they didn't let us in because they wanted to. So yeah, the efforts have definitely been to deny us access, and that's one of the problems. Before, we didn't speak the language, okay, couldn't read Medu Neter. We didn't have access to go into these tombs and temples. A lot of us didn't know to go there in the first place and didn't have the resources to go. So yeah, those efforts are there, they've been there, and they're still being there, and they're still going to deny it. What they'll say is that although they may be black and they may have kinky hair, those are not characteristics that we would use to classify somebody as African. Okay, so I mean, one tries to use all sorts of acrobatics and turns to come out of it, you know, to say, well, what does a true Negro look like? A true African. Well, a true African could have very broad nose, very kinky hair, you know, any number of characteristics who are what they would call true African. For the most part, none of us up here would be Africans if we use that definition that they would use to limit who an African was. So African people come in all different shades, all different hair texture. We know that in our own community, in our own families, as a matter of fact, we can tell, you know, just in our own families,
Well,
we
in
have
our
a
own
wide
families,
range.
the gene pools have been corrupted, so
That's
we have
true.
to give some credence
Oh,
to
yeah,
that.
definitely that.
But the thing is that within many of these temples and tombs, and we have, you know, just libraries of slides, so we can show all of these various shades and textures and so forth that were all identified as Kemetic. that existed there at that time. And speaking about that, some years ago, there were back in between the thought of history before 1850 about that part of the world and the thought of history after 1850 in that part of the world was what used to be described as the old Hamite hypothesis versus the new Hamite hypothesis. The Hamite hypothesis coming from the notion from Genesis 10, where Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and that Ham was supposed to be identified as the one who became the black one through this so-called curse, none of which is true. This is the ideas of a particular French writer by the name of Topinard, which we also find written in the Talmud, which is the Jewish oral literature that is used in an attempt to define what is written in the Old Testament scriptures. But the old Hamite hypothesis, all the writings from then, I have many books from the 1830s, 1820s period where they identified the peoples of Babylonia and Sumeria as black, the ancient Kemetic people as black. But then after this period of time, after 1850, a switch occurred. And then you read books where all of a sudden all these people are white. And so I think by us going and analyzing and looking at this literature and presenting this information to our people so that they know exactly what the evidence is and how the subterfuge has occurred.
Story changed.
How the story has changed over time. Only then can we begin to go back and rectify this. And one of the ways we rectify this is not only by going there and seeing what is written and on the monuments and tombs, but we have classes where we teach people how they can read the particular monuments and read the documents and see for themselves what it says, so that, you know, it's not like something we made up, because we're not making this up. This is something that's been sitting there for thousands of years.
And it's not a mystery.
That's right. And it's not a mystery.
It's a mystery if you don't know how to read it, right? Like anything else. But it's not a mystery in that sense. And that's one of the reasons the Kemetic Institute came about.
Yes.
I mean, this was the ideal about Dr. Carruthers and others who thought that this was a way to do research, and that's the whole purpose of the Kemetic Institute, is the research to promote the ideas, to advance the culture and civilization of ancient Africa.
How do you offer these classes?
We have community classes. We usually have them usually in the fall and in the winter. We also have what we call Teaching About Africa. We've been doing that for the last 15 years along with Northwestern University. We'll be starting January 10th at the Center for Inner City Studies. There are 8 sessions. We bring in teachers from the Chicago Public Schools, but also other school systems as well, and show them how to incorporate African studies throughout the curriculum using Illinois state guidelines, because it shouldn't be just limited to February, of course. So we've been doing that for a number of years now. Like I said, we'll be starting January 10th, and it's 8 sessions. We'll be at the Center for Inner City Studies, but we also go to Northwestern. We go to the Oriental Institute to expose teachers to other places where they can find this information, because it is available. It's just knowing where to go and how to incorporate those, implement those in your classroom. And that's for teachers pre-K through high school.
You know, you have been called, and Hunter has been called this, you know, you've been called out of your names. You've been called revisionists. You know, the plagiarists have called you revisionists. In fact, the original revisionists were the people who are now calling you the revisionist, because they do not want you to alter history in terms of what is true about history. They want to come through and challenge you and agree among themselves that what they have written and what they are researching is the truth, and what you are presenting is some kind of myth, some kind of wishful thinking about who you wish you were and where you wish you had been. Well, how do you deal with that when you come across that?
Well, I think that part of it is, first off, they were completely caught off guard by what we did. Completely caught off guard, because they were not prepared for the challenge that we were going to present and how we presented it. It's not like we didn't sit up in classes right there and study to learn these things all along, and it's not like we didn't stand before them and learn all of these things, but what they were unprepared for was what our mission was. Our mission was to right the wrong. But this is not something that we just started. I mean, it's people like Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop has been doing this since the 1950s, and we can go back to the Hosea Easton, Martin Delaney. We can go back David Walker,
John G.
John G. Jackson, several
John
people,
Henry Clark.
Henry Clark, J.C.B. Graff John. I mean, we can go on and on. You know, that people who have been out there saying these things. But what we have done is taking this to that next level by while they were saying all these things and getting all this research and writing all this stuff, now what we're doing is saying, you know, all of those, what Dr. Anderson Thompson referred to as old scrappers, all of them who were doing all that work, now we're coming forward and we're verifying everything that they said. And with the ones, in the step further that we're doing is, you know, we're going over there. We're going to the great museums. We're going to the British Museum. We're going to the Louvre. We're going to look at the stuff, and we can read what we see when it comes. And then trying to share this with the community. You know, and those who want to learn are always welcome if they're serious about learning, because we're a very serious organization when it comes to what we do.
I think too, again, by showing where they did the revising themselves. So when we look at Champollion, who's the father of Egyptology, and when he wrote a journal, and we can read his journal, he wrote it in French, and we can read what he wrote. We read what his brother wrote and how he changed things. How Frank Yorko, in an article that he wrote, where he actually, I proved Frank Yorko.
Where is he at?
Well, he's at the Oriental Institute and the Field Museum, where he, you know, was caught in a lie. But more importantly than that, in the postscript to that, in African of Egyptology, where I confronted him, and he himself had to admit that he had lied. Now, this was a major victory for African-centered scholarship, because he had been caught in a lie and he admitted it. Okay, so I mean, that's important, and so we have to expose those individuals anywhere anytime we find them, and that's one of the things that, you know, at the Kemetic Institute and the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization, which is a larger organization that we happen to be a part of. Again, we're doing that, and these other organizations.
And it's happening many places also. In London, there's a Nigerian writer, Ben Okri, who's written a trilogy of books, Famous Road, the last one, Infinite Riches, and Songs of Enchantment. And it's really a story in the Akwi Arma tradition of the turmoil that Nigeria went through during colonialization, and when they finally broke free from at least political colonialization. But he has a point that in one chapter of his last book, Infinite Riches, he talks about that we're in a battle of rewritten histories, and how our histories have been rewritten. And so we have to work to rewrite the rewritten histories to get the story straight, because our people are depending upon that. And to follow up on what Professor Ben Levi was saying about the black people, they had Osiris as the example as to what you wanted to be, the so-called Lord of the Dead, but he wasn't really the Lord of the Dead, even though we mainly see him in the underworld, but he was known as the Lord of the perfect black, that one had attained this exalted consciousness. And so a lot of times when we see Kemetic people, you see them red, men red, well, that's for the dawning sun, to reflect that kind of consciousness. If you see women painted yellow, that's because that's the sun at its zenith. You know, that's talking about a state of consciousness that the people were shooting for, that they were representing. And black also refers to that which is hidden. Amen, that which is hidden, what's hidden within yourself that you got to bring out and perfect. And so that dimension of it, the Egyptologists don't deal with at all.
Would it be correct to think that they don't deal with it because they don't understand it? You see, very often when people set themselves up as experts on things about which they don't know little or nothing, they give explanations that actually aren't founded in anything except that they have to give some sort of explanation or rationale in order to be an expert. I think about H.I. Hayakawa. He once wrote an essay. He decided that he should write an essay and he should talk about black music. And you're too young to know this song, but Louis Jordan had a song called I'm Gonna Move on the Outskirts of Town. I don't want nobody always hanging around. H.I. Hayakawa said that Louis Jordan's song was about urban congestion and overpopulation when it had nothing. You see, he said, I must confess, you know, I know little or nothing about black music. But it didn't prevent him from having an essay on it. Right. It didn't prevent him from misinterpreting the lyrics, which, of course, this is a man with a beautiful wife. Mm-hmm. He's moving on the outskirts of town because he don't want nobody always hanging around. See, and every black person, literate or not, every black person understood what Louis Jordan was talking about. But H.I. Hayakawa didn't know.
Missed it altogether.
But the point is that it does not prevent, and when I think about how they appropriate unto themselves expertise in everything, include every language, including the so-called black English. You know, when I first came to the Center for Inner City Studies, they actually had someone there, whose name I will not mention, who was not a black person, who was a so-called expert on black English, and very often I would see this same person on television explaining to people what we meant when we used certain terms. It's impossible for you to ignore that other people are speaking for you and that other people are lying about you, sometimes deliberately because they want to present another story. And very often out of ignorance because they don't know what you meant. So for either reason, we must restore our people to their rightful place in history.
You know, you're absolutely right, particularly on the point of what they know. Our people then, as today, were always a very spiritual people. We're always trying to connect with the presence of the Creator, God, the gods of their town, or what have you. These writers, for the most part, were not spiritual people. They couldn't see that. You know, they're trying to write an academic treatise on something that's profoundly spiritual and multidimensional, multivalent, polysymbiotic. If you can't bring, and if you don't know music, you can forget about it, because these were songs, as Kalan Phil Quran would talk about. When you're reading that, you're reading songs. You know, so if you can't bring that to the table as a background, then you can only get the very rudiments, and then they get that wrong. And so we have generations of people who got it wrong. So it's a profound project to work to try to correct this false history, that our history has been falsified.
And it has been plagiarized. Is Akhenaten associated with the so-called Psalms of David? Is it believed?
The 104th Psalms is very much, very much like the hymn to Aten. And the thing that the text is identified as the hymn to Aten. There's much in it that is clearly like that. But then there are also other things that are related biblically.
By day.
That we see. The 125th chapter where there are those who would argue that the so-called Ten Commandments, even though, as I like to always explain to people, there's nowhere in Exodus 20 or in Deuteronomy 5 that it says, and the Lord spoke unto Moses, says, these are the Ten Commandments. It never says that, except somewhere that's read in the caption at the top of their Bible somewhere. Because actually it's called the Eseret HaDevarim in Hebrew, which means the 10 words or the 10 sayings. So, but there are many things in it, but they were not commandments, because the Hebrew word for commandment, mitzvah, is never used there. So, but it says that you have not, what it means, the reason why they say it's called a commandment, if I could just throw on my biblical scholar hat here for a minute. The reason why they refer to them as commandments, because they are written in what's referred to as the Zewui form. The Zewui form is command form. You don't do this, or you don't do that. You know, it's like it says, we read in English where it says, thou shalt not kill. Well, it doesn't say kill, it says lo tirzaka, which means thou shalt not murder. You murder people, you kill animals because you have to slaughter them, you know, for the sacrifice and stuff in the temple. So it says thou shalt not murder, that's what it really says. So it says you shall not murder. Well, it says the same thing in the book of the Coming Forth by Day, which is misrepresented and mistranslated as the Book of the Dead. That's not what it's called. It's called the Book of the Coming Forth by Day.
Well, another thing I think that I find interesting is that here in the biblical sense, you have somebody telling you or what you shouldn't do, but in order for in the Kemetic sense, for you to enter into the netherworld, you have to be able to say, I have not done these
Right,
things.
so
But even
the
more
negative
importantly-
confession.
Right.
More importantly, there's another, and that's been mistranslated, that it really states that I do not do this. I do not do this while I'm living, and I don't do it in the afterlife either.
Right, and they call it negative because it uses a word, nin, which means not. So the Egyptologists, you know, the European Egyptologists have identified this as the negative confessions, but nowhere in the Kemetic, you know,
It's not negative.
right? It's
Yeah,
declarations of innocence.
Declarations of innocence. I haven't done.
I haven't done that.
Declarations of
I haven't
innocence.
done
I do not do this.
I do not do
I
this.
do
I
not
don't
do
lie.
I don't lie. Right. I don't steal.
steal.
I don't, you know.
I don't wade in the water and disturb the fish.
Right.
You know, I don't pollute the air.
Yeah, so these are things,
You know, and
there's
so forth and so
there are
on.
other ones that would probably be important to this community as well. You know, I haven't had sex with
My neighbor's wife.
not only neighbor's wife, but you know, with a man speaking, I have not had sex with a man.
With a man, that's right, sure does. Says that.
That's there as well. So I mean, there are a number of lessons that we can gain from those declarations of innocence.
Right, and I think a part of one of the things we're doing is a part of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. We have a research commission. And the research commission has produced one of its reports called the Preliminary Challenge, in which we look at where we beginning to re-research a lot of this material and beginning to reassess it and begin to rewrite it properly so that we can begin to understand exactly what it is that we need to get out here for people to understand. This is a long project that we're talking about here that not only involves an analysis of the calendar and the way it's set up, but a look at the organization of Kemetic history and how it's laid out, and several other things.
The House of Life.
The House of Life, Perach, right.
Yeah.
That was their university.
Yeah, right.
By the way, ASCAC will be having their conference, international conference here in Chicago next
In
year.
March.
In March.
In March of next year.
March
The dates?
10th to the 14th, I believe. 10th
The location?
The
Malcolm X.
site will be Malcolm X.
Okay.
And again, you can call the Center for Inner City Studies.
Okay,
and
what's that? 773-268-7500?
Yeah, 268-7500, extension 145. Ask for
Okay,
Rosetta Cash or
okay,
Yvonne
okay.
Jones to get more information about that.
And I think I probably should point out right here and right now, this is not an all-male organization.
No, it isn't.
absolutely
No. The founding director is Jacob Carruthers, as we mentioned. We have now the new director is Leon Harris, but assistant director is Yvonne Jones and Roosevelt Roberts. And we have a number of ladies and women in the organization. They just put us up here today, and if we don't do a good job, believe me, we will be pulled down. Right. And, they will, but yeah, we're an organization of both men and women, and we all do research of sorts. I mean, that's one of the things about coming into the Kemetic Institute. It's not a organization of twiddling your thumbs. You come in and you do work. You find an area that you want to research after you've learned, and then you go about doing it.
So you think you're bad? Come on up in here,
Hey,
and let's see.
let's see, come on.
You know, because
Come
you
on.
will be checked.
Most definitely.
Most definitely. And
You will be researched.
Right.
Right.
And we expect people to really come in and get their hands dirty. And I mean, we're working on a project. You know, Dr. Anderson Thompson is working toward a project where we're going to really do serious investigation in Nubia. And we're talking about going so far as not only going there and doing a survey of a site, but actually going and doing some archaeological work and digging up some things because. we've been studying the Meroitic language, the language that they used in Meroe and Napata, and trying to get an understanding of that. And while there's not much known about how to translate certain things from that language, we're working on trying to understand it, along with other things. So we have people in the Kemetic Institute who have, varieties of skills. I mean, there are areas where Hunter is strong, I can't touch. But I have my areas, Charles has his area, and we got other people. Everybody's got their areas where they're strong, and together we make a mighty fist. And the beautiful thing is that in all these years that we've been doing this work, and there are people out there, a lot of people out there know how to say hotep. But they have no clue
where
that started, where that came from, and how they got out there like that.
Right.
Well, with the Kemetic Institute, we started there because we used that as a greeting with one another.
Hotep.
And now it's all over the world.
It was even in the movie. It was a group. I forget the name of the movie, but it was had to do with women in prison, and there was a group of women who called themselves the Hotep Sisters.
Okay.
When I heard it,
That
was
was
like,
Civil Brand.
Well,
Okay,
the
okay,
Asara
Civil Brand.
Set Society uses the term Hetepu, which is another, well, they substitute different vowels into HTP, but the same thing is used. But I think that it's important that we understand why we must do this work. And one of the things that might help us have a clue is every time you turn on television, they're doing something with Egyptology. We're looking at Tutankhamun, we're looking at the Nubians. Why are they trying to sell us? I mean, they want to tell us our story.
Can I just say for a minute? Well, one of the things that I have been observing is that these people who are doing this work are aware of who we are collectively. They know that we're out there, and so they're trying to find ways to combat what we say. For example, I was just reading recently a report done by a German person who specializes in Nubia in Meroe, named Fritz Hentz. Fritz Hentz did a whole article on the Nubian view of Nubia, the Egyptologist view of Nubia, and interestingly enough, he had a portion that said the Afrocentrist view of Nubia. And I thought that was very interesting. That means that people are looking at it while we don't, look at it the Afrocentric. That's not where we're coming from with this. But they're trying to label us like that. And I know Charles does something in relation to this in his book too. On the Howl guy. And I thought it was very interesting, but that they know we're out there, and to prepare themselves for what is it that we've got coming. I mean, essentially, when Sheikh Anta Diop and Theophile Obenga went to Paris, to the Cairo conference that they had under the United Nations Scientific and Cultural Organization in '74 on the peopling of ancient Egypt and the deciphering of the Meroitic script, it was clear at that conference that the issue of whether or not the ancient Kemetic people were Africans or not was settled. That was settled, and in a lot of ways we have settled that, and now we're pushing on to some deeper things. Now we want to move on to some deeper things, because that battle, we have won that battle. That battle is
Well,
good.
I want to issue a caveat. Again, when I came to the Center for Inner City Studies to Northeastern, and I found this professor in the classroom who was not black, but who was teaching black people what their language meant to them. He sent the students out to collect audio tapes of black people in communication in the beauty shops, the post office, the barber shop, the pool hall, the liquor store, the church.
Yeah, we have to be very careful.
But wait a minute, understand this. And then our examination was interpret these tapes. What I'm saying is he had the students teaching him. Because if they had simply brought him back a tape and given it to him to listen to, he would not know what was going on in that communication. But to give it as an examination, and then the student had to interpret and expel out what it meant that the so-called teacher was being taught how to remain an expert. And this is the caveat I'm issuing to you. There are things that they do not know. you will be teaching them too, not just teaching us. You will be teaching more of them maybe than you will be teaching us, because unfortunately we tend sometimes not to have a great interest in ourselves and in our history, and consequently those things that they had not understood before, that only you are capable of understanding because it is you, and it's your experience, and it's in your cultural DNA. You in fact may unlock certain keys, certain doors that have been closed to them, which of course they will never admit that you've done. But when you see the book, when the book came out by this author, with Elkin Satole having an essay in there, with Grace Holt having an essay in there, then you knew that there are always people who are watching you, especially if you know what you're doing. If you say you have skill in your areas, you have skill in areas where they have no skill. And so they will be watching you very closely so that they can close those gaps, and that they can continue to remain experts on our history. So just understand that we must make the common black people, the lay black people who don't think that they need to know chemitology. I refuse to call it Egyptology. We're not studying Egyptology because we're not studying Egypt, and we're not the only thing I want to know about Egypt is why in the Bible they are presented as the bad guys. They're supposed to be down there just, enslaving folk and hold them in bondage, Somebody speak to that in this few minutes.
I'm going to let you speak to that, because that's your field. But, as far as the archaeology goes,
okay.
First of all, very few Egyptologists, because that's what they will even admit to that. I mean, because they accept there is no evidence to support that story. Yeah, I get tired of it, our people saying, because I get tired of them beating up on Pharaoh on Sunday. Now, Pharaoh was us,
Explain that to us.
I'll let Ben.
Come on, Ben.
Well, part of the problem with the ideas, there are several things. One, when we see this pop up later in the book of so-called Book of Genesis, but certainly in Exodus. First of all, we don't know who Pharaoh is. Next, the notion that when the children of Israel were in Egypt, that they built the pyramids is false, because it doesn't even say that, because the pyramids are on the Giza Plateau, and it said the children of Israel built the store cities Pithom and Ramesses. Pithom and Ramesses are nowhere near Giza. Next, it doesn't, the implication, and this is partly due to the work of Cecil B. DeMille.
Yeah,
all right.
Let's not forget him.
Cecil B. DeMille's implication that these people were slaves in Egypt is not true, because first, when we look at Asiatics, so-called the so-called Asiatics, as they were people who they in the Medunetia defined as Amu, they were in there much earlier before that time. Secondly, and I have written extensively on the question of who these people are, because the assumptions that these people were the people called the Hyksos. That Flavius Josephus describes in his complete works. Flavius Josephus was a historian, a Hebrew historian who was a priest of the Pharisees, who lived during the time that the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, and he wrote a history of that. Well, he uses this term Hyksos there, but now we know that the real term is Heka Kasut, which meant rulers of the foreign lands, or rulers from across over there, the sand dwellers. But in no case does that identify them as the, quote, so-called children of Israel. Furthermore, if I can just step out here for a minute, because I know I'm going to step on some toes here, but this is the evidence.
Go ahead.
All right? The evidence is that there is not a single archaeologist or Egyptologist that can find anything that suggests anything about the children of Israel being in Egypt. Now, I know there are those who would argue that because of Pharaoh Mereneptah. Pharaoh Mereneptah wrote a stela, which was a monument that they refer to as the Israel stela, because in the Israel stela, the name of Israel is mentioned. But the name of Israel is not mentioned as a people in Kemet. It was mentioned as a people outside of Kemet who had been defeated, because it said, it says Israel is defeated, their seed is no more. That's the whole sentence, and that's it. There's no other real evidence there. Now, there are those who would argue that there is something there, but there really isn't. I mean, that's the bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, but like I said, if the Egyptologists themselves won't even admit to that. I mean, they admit that, first of all, there were no slaves. Slaves
right,
was
there
not
were
a
no
big
slaves.
issue.
There was not.
Slaves
That's
didn't
right.
build the
slaves.
pyramids.
Right, slaves did not build the pyramids.
Right.
And Mark Lehner recently did a special on talking about the people who built the pyramid. These were people who were competing to see who could be the best.
Right, it was a public works project.
It was a public works project.
That's kind of hard for us to
the-
understand, you know, that much dedication
Right.
to an individual. But there was that.
And another point was the organization that had to be in place in order to make it happen, and to make it happen again and again and again
Right.
for thousands of years.
Right.
I mean, those temples, when you see them, they weren't just put up overnight. There was profound planning that went into place.
A lot of
There was
architecture.
testing that had to
Yes,
be done.
yes,
Things
design.
had to be in line with the cosmic energies.
Absolutely.
Plus, people were
you know,
fed well.
Fed very well.
They were taken care of.
Yes, they were.
Their
And
families.
they had
so, I
ate
mean,
more
and that
than bread,
information's
beer, and
there.
watermelons. And those Egyptian watermelons are really good. That's when you see when you taste one of those watermelons, you know that they were black people.
When they talk about a letter from home, they
Right.
literally.
Right. So that, and like I said, so there's really none of that was there, but that's the projection because the media has projected that out there through the movie The Ten Commandments. But the fact of the matter is the evidence doesn't support that. And I mean, there are many other things, but that would involve a whole nother show by itself.
Well, you know, we may do a whole other show by itself because I'm not through. I mean,
Right,
I
to
am
talk about
thirsty.
just to
You're
talk
also
about the origin and development
passionate
of the
about
biblical
Well,
these
that's one thing
things.
about it because, it brings you into it. I mean, we become a part of it. I mean,
Right.
we sit up among
It's our
ourselves.
story.
Right.
And and we do the same thing. But the thing is, I think it's important to say is that we don't just say these things without supporting evidence. And that's one of the problems that has been in the past. People say things, but they can't substantiate it.
This
We
is
can
not
substantiate
feel-good history.
No,
Right.
no, it's a long way from that.
Right.
You know.
Well, you know, they keep flashing this thing, telling me we're running out of time. Well, I got some more hours of television, and we'll come back up in here. But I want to congratulate you for your book, Charles Grantham, and recommend that people go to their local bookstore or library and pick up their own copy. And of course, you can always go down and study with Charles Grantham at the Kemetic Institute on Oakwood Boulevard in Langley, as you can with Ben Levi, Josef Ben Levi, and of course, Hunter Haviland Adams III is always available to teach privately and in various and sundry other places. And you will be seeing these gentlemen again, and I know I will hear from you because you didn't know we had this, did you? I did, and that's why my eyes were gleaming when I came on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.